So first, before we get to splitting, which is a very important part of object relations, we need to go over what Klein described as projective identification. So anybody who studied psychology, even basic psychology, has heard the word defense mechanisms. Defense mechanisms are basically mechanisms of the ego, which are used by your ego to protect you from distressing aspects of yourself or of your environment. So basically, denial, for example, is the most easiest defense mechanism that I can describe you. You keep using the word denial. This one's in denial, that one's in denial. What does it actually mean? It means that that person's ego is not allowing them to accept a certain news or a certain piece of information that might be too distressing for their subconscious mind, like the id. So this was basically the idea of a defense mechanism. Now, Klein felt that projective identification is also a defense mechanism, and it is kind of used to protect the ego from anxiety, but I feel that it was more than protecting the ego from anxiety. If you read object relations, projective identification as a defense mechanism, especially in infants, is used more to gather information, in my opinion, and I'll show you how. So imagine that as an individual, you have certain ideas about yourself that are intolerable to your ego and superego. You use the mechanism of assigning that intolerable feeling to another person, thus successfully portraying another as bad and protecting your own idea of yourself. This is essentially what projection is. So, for example, when something about somebody irritates you a lot, and you don't understand why, like what is it about this person that really irritates you? In psychotherapeutic terms, you are probably, not always, because sometimes people just can be very annoying and they can get under your skin, but in most cases, psychotherapists would say that you're projecting. That means there is something about yourself that you see in yourself, and because that idea of you is not very easy for you to accept, you start projecting it onto another person. You say, this person is the reason I'm like this. Very typical to see in relationship problems, where you can't explain why this person gets under your skin, but there is something about them that just gets under your skin. Another good example is, for example, in women with the personality disorders, many a times they hallucinate or they have delusions that men are attracted to them. Most often there is not real attraction. It's the woman who's projecting her own attractions to men, but it's because she can't accept that she is promiscuous and she wants relationships with these men. Because she's not able to accept that idea of herself, she projects them onto those men. So these are examples of projection. So that is the projective part of projective identification. But projective identification together is a bit different from projection. According to Klein, we use projective identification for developing ideas about the world and how we in turn relate to it. So one is the projection part. The other part of projective identification is the identification. Now, how does identification happen? Identification means basically, like she says, that how we develop ideas about the world, how we develop ideas about our relationships, how we develop ideas about ourselves. We identify with something. And then once we identify with that thing, we tend to absorb it into ourselves. For example, for me, the most typical example in India would be a spiritual guru. So many people are attracted to the calmness and the peacefulness of spiritual gurus, and over a period of time, once they attend sessions and they attend meditations, they feel that they are calming down, they're becoming peaceful. This, in my opinion, as a psychotherapist, would be identification. You are identifying with that part of that spiritual guru who you look up to, which you aspire to be. You introject that part of this person into yourself, and hence you identify with that aspect of that person, and you make it a part of your own personality. So this is introjection, which is the opposite of projection. Now, for example, let's say in the case of object relations theory, the infant is extremely obsessed with the mother's breast, because that is his survival. And that is a very good object in his opinion, or his in that very limited part of his world where he only needs to survive the first few months of his life. He doesn't need to think about anything else. The breast is seen as the central object, and is the good object in this case, and thus he starts to introject that goodness that he feels from his mother's breast into his own personality, which is why breastfeeding has been such a big part of psychoanalysis, and it's been so emphasized by psychoanalysis that by denying breastfeeding, you are somewhere affecting the goodness in your child's personality. This is what a psychoanalyst would conclude. Like I said, introjection means that you absorb that of another person which you like into your own self. It's the opposite of projection. And so what the infant does is, like I said, that the parts of the mother which he or she perceives as good or bad is absorbed, introjected into himself or herself, and it mingles and becomes a part of the infant's own psyche. In this case, it's the reason why the emphasis is on the breast is because the infant is not yet aware of, a newborn infant is not yet aware of the mother as a human being, as a person. To an infant, the mother is the breast, which is the source of nutrition. So hence, it's either good or bad. It's either perceived as good or bad, and you'll see how in the next few slides. Now, what happens is that, according to Klein, when the breast is perceived as good, it's only perceived as good. When the breast is perceived as bad, it's only perceived as bad. Now, you have to understand, like I said again here, the reason why she's emphasizing the mother's breast is because the mother is not perceived as a whole human being yet. To the infant, the mother is just the breast, which is the source of nutrition. So she's either good or she's bad. And once that good or bad is introjected onto the self, it can only be good or it can only be bad. And this is what Klein means by splitting. The parts of the personality of the infant are split into either good or bad. There is no gray area here. Mother is either seen as good or bad. Infant sees themselves as either good or bad. And this is the idea of splitting. Like I said, so splitting essentially for Klein, it meant that the split of the personality is either good or bad. There is no gray area. So now, why was introjection such a big part of Klein's theory? It was because Klein felt that we need to introject good objects, good parts of our object, primary caregiver, which is our mother, into ourselves, so that in times of need, we use those mechanisms to self-soothe. This is, according to me, Klein's most important point that she's mentioned in her theory, because if you think about every time you've been distressed, every time you've been in trouble, every time you've been in a moment of weakness, no matter how old you are, where you are, whatever you're doing, the first person generally that comes to your mind is your mother. And what Klein felt was that in people who were able to introject or able to develop the good self from the good breast, were able to use that part of their personality, which they absorbed from the mother, to remind them of the fact that there is a good mother, there is a good breast, a good object out there, and it is self-soothing. It acts as a buffer in times of need. And if you are not able to do that, if your object relation with your mother is not good, or you have only bad memories of her, or you only remember the bad breast, that you will basically not be able to engage in self-soothing. And hence, you see so many people who are not able to deal with mental health problems. Like Klein would say that they had people who are not able to soothe themselves in times of need, who are not able to deal with difficult situations on their own, don't have the capacity to self-soothe. They don't have the good breast introjected into them enough. Maybe some of it, but not enough to protect them from, difficult situations in life. And hence they slip into this sort of depression, anxiety. This is what Melanie Klein would say if she were alive today?